Morning folks, welcome to another one of my fireside chats. This week I thought I'd ask this question, and the question is, are you a painter that wargames or a wargamer that paints? Well, that's an interesting question, isn't it? Or maybe it's not. I am definitely of the latter. I'm definitely a wargamer that paints. Yes, started off the wargaming before I was painting. That's a definite. My first foray into wargaming obviously would be as a little lad, as a youngster, and I would have had packs of Airfix figures, World War II, plastic tanks, the soft poly tanks, etc, etc, and obviously no painting was involved. I probably wouldn't have been allowed to paint if mother had got me with paint in the bedroom or perhaps on the dining room table. I think she'd had a fit. So my first painting, Wargames painting, would have been my plastic American Civil War, and that would have been using the little Humbrol tinlets of enamel paint with terps for thinners, and that will have stunk the place out. I can remember getting moaned out for the smell and spilling it and making a mess, even then as a teenager. Yeah, Humbrol paints, enamels. Obviously made up some kits as well. I remember making World War II kits, aircraft and paints and etc, etc. The reason I'm asking the question of wargamer that paints or a painter that wargames is, to me, the game's more important, which sadly in the past has meant I've used unpainted figures. I know, shock horror, but I think as a wargamer you're desperate to get the figures. I have a picture that a painter that wargames, and I've seen some of the guys on here that do fantastic jobs. I think to them the painting is far more important, and they wouldn't dream to put figures on a tabletop that weren't crisp and perfect and to top standard. I'm not like that. I can be a bit lazy with the painting, I will admit, with the "oh, that'll do" attitude sometimes if I'm desperate to get some figures painted and on the tabletop. Another time they'll hopefully be works of art, he says. I recall then the Humbrol acrylics coming out in those little tinlets. This is the plastic tins. They were a lifesaver. Water based, obviously. Humbrol acrylics, and also the Tamiya paints. Very strong smelling. I remember those. I haven't used those for years, but our local model shop / hobby shop, toy shop, did have the Tamiya in. Obviously used to sell a lot of Tamiya kits, so I suppose that's why they had the Tamiya. So used those for a while. Weren't too bad, but for some reason it must have been that the Humbrol were better, so I used a lot of Humbrol. The problem was the price. They kept going up and up and up. And then I discovered, now this will shock you, or perhaps it won't, the mixed paints. The paints, the household paints, the B&Qs and the crowns and the etc types. So I don't know when that was started, whether that was in the 80s, must have been in the 80s, maybe even the 90s. You could go to B&Q or Crown or somewhere and they would scan, or they would mix a paint up to suit. So what I did was took some Humbrol paints. I used to paint. What they wanted you to do was put a bit of paint onto a piece of card or a piece of board, and they would scan it or scan it. I'm sure they did. Don't know when they started doing that. And I would then use household paints for painting. I know, shock horror. And in the main, my most of my painting life has been using household paints. The little tinlets. I mean, to start with, they were very cheap, 50 pence. 50 pence a tin, and then it was 75 or £1 a tin. So much cheaper than the official Tamiya or Humbrol paints. So I'm using household paints in the little tins. For metallics, I did buy in, there would be craft metallic, again acrylic paints. You get the silver, gold, brasses, bronzes, coppers. You could get those. That's the craft paints. I remember buying those. Our local photography shop used to sell those. So, but most of my 25s and all of my 15mm, when I was painting 15mm Napoleonics, were painted using household paints. Spray undercoat, white or black spray, a lot of black spray for the Napoleonics. I painted the black technique, so paint on top, leaving the edges. For the 25mm, that would have been a white technique, putting the paint on, and then used a lot of the black varnish in the early days, if you remember. That was mixing black paint in with the varnish, yacht varnish, or all sorts of varnishes, mixing either black paint or brown. I think we preferred black, but that sort of died out in the 1990s. I remember doing that in the early 1980s. I bought some figures from Milliard and a company called Military Miniatures, and they were using that technique. So that would be in the early 1980s. So I was mixing the varnishing and black varnishing. That's the 25mm figures. I think I've still got a few of those left somewhere. But the 15mm, I say, was black undercoat and household paints. And I did that right up until, probably only about 5 years ago, 5-6 years ago, then I bought my first Villaggio paints. And I still use a few household paints now. I'm not proud, I'm quite happy to say they're plenty good enough. As you know, if you see me undercoat, I use it's called a Boston Brown Bread, actually. It's a Valspar undercoat, and I do like that as an undercoat. So that's me, my painting. Lazy, sometimes good, sometimes not so good, but I'm definitely a wargamer that paints. I say household through to Villaggio. Those are my paints. Never used fantasy paints, never knowingly used fantasy paints, but that's for political reasons, so if you know what I mean. A wargamer that paints. Anyway, that's a little run through of me, figures and painting. So thanks a lot, and bye for now.